class, in this video we're going to talk about the endocrine system. So the endocrine system and the nervous system are really the more major systems that help us to maintain homeostasis in our body. Of course, all of our systems work together to maintain homeostasis. But so the nervous system is for rapid responses, right? We learned about the nervous system already. It's for sending signals very, very quickly to different parts of our bodies to have some sort of response, right? Like a muscle response by doing some sort of movement, or to a gland and to send out some sort of hormone, right? So they work together. The endocrine system works a bit more slowly over time, right? Our hormones are slowly secreted over time to make us who we are, maintain our body's homeostasis, okay? So nervous system uses neurotransmitters and the endocrine system releases hormones, okay? So most hormones are going to circulate through the blood system. So you'll have some cell, okay, and it's secreting some hormone. It's going to go through the blood system to some far away target cell. Okay, so that's just a cell that hormone acts on, okay? So it's going to go through, let's say we have like a little blood capillary here. Now it's going to travel through the capillary and then eventually get to our target cell. And let's say our target cell has some receptors for that hormone, okay? Remember, our neurotransmitters also bound to receptors on the next neuron or on the muscle cell, etc. Okay, so kind of very similar, but also a little bit different, right? So while most of our hormones go through the blood system, okay, the circulatory system to get to target cells, there are two other ways that hormone can get to its target cell. So we have paracrines and autocrines. Paracrines both of these don't go through the circulatory system. Paracrines, you'll have your starting cell secreting a hormone to a very nearby cell. So the cell's right here, and the hormone will bind to the receptors. So it doesn't have a need to go through the whole circulatory system. Okay, so this is like estrogen as an example. So estrogen is made in the ovaries, and one of the types of cells that it acts on would be in the uterus. So they're very close by, so it doesn't need to go through the whole circulatory system to get there. Okay, so estrogen. And then autocrines, like an autobiography is writing something about yourself, right? So they act on themselves. So we have our cell here. Okay, and then we have receptors on that same cell. So it sends out its hormone and it acts upon itself. Okay, so it makes the hormone or releases the hormone, and that hormone acts upon the same tissue. Okay, so that would be like insulin. So insulin is made in the pancreas and it acts on the pancreas as well. Okay, so that's in general how those endocrine glands can work, the three different ways. So it can be a circulating hormone, a paracrine acting on something very close by, doesn't need to go through the circulatory system, or an autocrine acts upon itself, okay? Okay, so remember back to AMP1, right, we learned about exocrine glands. So exo because they secrete things onto the surface of skin. Okay, so I just wanted to go through the difference between that. So endocrine glands secrete things within the body. Exocrine glands secrete things to the outside or surface of the body, and they don't secrete hormones, right? Remember, our exocrine glands were like those sweat and oil glands, okay? And also the ceruminous glands in the ear. okay? Mucus glands as well. So those secrete to the outside of a surface, right? Not necessarily to the outside of the body, but to the outside of a surface, okay? And digestive glands are also exocrine glands, okay? So those secrete into different organs of the body. Okay. So we have our major endocrine glands, right? So that would be in the brain, we have the pituitary gland. In the neck, we have the thyroid gland, and behind the thyroid are the parathyroid glands. The adrenal glands, adrenal means above the kidney. Anytime you hear the word renal, it means kidneys, okay? And pineal glands. So the pineal gland is that small little gland toward the back of the center of the brain, like right behind the thalamus, and that secretes melatonin, okay? So those are, and we have the thymus gland as well, which sits right above the heart, okay? So those are some of the major endocrine glands, but we also can find secreting cells in other areas of the body that aren't just for the endocrine system, okay? So this would be like the hypothalamus, right, which is in the brain. That's one of our major endocrine areas of the body that has secreting cells, okay? The pancreas, so the pancreas is an organ behind the stomach that secretes lots of different, like insulin, right, that we talked about already. The skin, the heart even secretes a few different hormones, adipose tissue, and if you're pregnant, you create this new organ known as the placenta, and that secretes hormones as well. Okay, so even though those aren't specifically endocrine glands, they do have secreting cells that do secrete hormones. Okay, so we said that hormones will travel through the body and affect target cells. So they can only affect specific cells that have specific receptors for that hormone, okay? And these receptors are continuously being synthesized, which means made, and broken down, okay, taken apart. So receptors can be, we need to control how much of a hormone we're sending out, right? Sometimes we need more of a specific hormone, sometimes we don't need as much of that hormone. Okay, we don't want to have too much of a hormone or not enough of a hormone, or else it causes all sorts of issues within our body, right? Again, the endocrine system helps to maintain our homeostasis, okay? So receptors can be downregulated if there's a high concentration of hormone. So say here, we have lots and lots of this hormone, right? And we have lots of receptors. So maybe at some point we needed whatever this hormone was, okay? But now we have so much of it, we don't want any more of it, so these receptors are going to be downregulated. They're going to be taken care of, right? And then maybe we're left with just a couple of receptors, okay? So we can still act on this cell a little bit with that hormone, but not so much that's going to cause something negative to happen to our body, okay? Or receptors can be upregulated if we don't have a high enough concentration of a hormone. So say we have a regular concentration or not enough, and we need more of this hormone on this target cell, then more receptors can be synthesized in that case. That's known as upregulation. So downregulation, taking away those receptors or breaking them down. Upregulation, synthesizing more of those receptors. Okay, so there's lots of different classes of hormones. Two major classes of hormones would be lipid soluble or water soluble. So lipid soluble hormones are like steroids, for example, right? So those are like, there's lots of different steroid hormones, like testosterone, for example. Thyroid hormones and nitric oxide are also lipid soluble. Water soluble hormones include amine hormones, peptide, protein hormones, and eicosanoid hormones, okay? So water soluble hormones, these can circulate freely in the plasma, which is the liquid portion of blood. We're gonna learn about that in the next unit, okay? So water soluble hormones are water soluble, so they fit right in with the blood, right? So they just circulate within the plasma of the blood. So these are the ones that can circulate throughout the body. Lipid-soluble hormones, fats and water do not mix, right? And plasma is basically just water, okay, within the blood, okay? So lipid-soluble hormones need to be bound to transport proteins. So proteins can kind of go around things that are hydrophobic, like lipids, and protect them. So they could put the hydrophobic part of the protein on the inside and the hydrophilic part of the protein on the outside so that the protein can travel nicely through the blood, but within it, it's holding that lipid-soluble hormone, okay? So again, water-soluble hormones just travel freely through the plasma of blood. They don't need to be bound or carried by anything, whereas lipid-soluble need to be bound within a protein to travel through the blood, okay? Okay, so our lipid-soluble hormones are going to bind to receptors that are found in the target cell. Okay, so erase this here. Okay, so here we have our blood capillary, and here we have our target cell. Okay, so lipid-soluble hormones are bound by a protein. So this protein here is holding our, here I'll draw the hormone in green. Okay, so it's keeping it nice and safe in that plasma there. Okay, now the hormone can exit the capillary and travel to the target cell. Okay, now it can diffuse right into the cell here. Okay, so now we have our lipid-soluble hormone right within that cell. Okay, so now here we have our nucleus of the cell. So that circle is going to be the nucleus of the cell. Okay, and we have these receptor hormone complexes, okay, that can change gene expression. So within our nucleus, we have these little complexes. The hormone is going to fit right into that little complex there, okay, and do whatever it needs to do. So create an RNA that can create a specific protein that does something in the body. Depending on what hormone this is, it could be various different things, right? Okay, and then our mRNA is going to be created within our ribosome, if you remember back from biology class, okay? And then it's going to do whatever it needs to do, okay? So it can alter this cell's activity in some way, okay? So let's just go through that one more time. So this is our lipid-soluble protein. It's bound, or lipid-soluble hormone. It's bound to a protein because it can't travel by itself within the blood. It's going to then leave by itself. It's not going to take the protein with it. It's going to leave the capillary by itself, enter into the target cell, go into the nucleus, and bind to a receptor hormone complex, which is then going to cause a new RNA to be made, which is going to synthesize a new protein, which is going to change this cell's activity in some way, depending on whatever this hormone is. Okay, so that's in general how lipid-soluble proteins work. Okay, now water-soluble protein, or water-soluble hormones, sorry, I keep saying proteins. Water-soluble hormones, they can bind to receptors on the outside of the target cell. So here we have our capillary, and our hormone is just freely floating through the plasma of the blood, okay? Then we have our target cell with those receptors, okay? So our water-soluble hormone is going to bind within these protein receptors, okay? So these receptors are specific for this specific hormone. Only this hormone will fit on this receptor, right? If any hormone could fit on this receptor, then things in our body would go crazy, right? So our water-soluble hormone flows freely through the plasma, exits, it also does the same thing, it exits the capillary and flows to our receptors on our target cell, okay? And then it eventually, you don't need to know the whole mechanism of action, but it'll get into the cell here, and same thing causes maybe some sort of protein to be made, and that alters the cell's activity. Okay, so very similar. The end result is the same, okay, or similar, right? Making some sort of protein that alters cell activity. Of course, these would be different hormones, so the actual activity would be different, okay? Okay, so let's talk about the different hormones. So steroid hormones. So steroid hormones, remember, are lipid soluble. That includes aldosterone. Okay, so that regulates the salt and water concentration in the body. And make sure you watch the other video. I go into detail. I'm gonna go like brief overviews of some of the hormones in this lecture, but in that other lecture, I go into a lot more detail on some of the major hormones, okay? So aldosterone is a steroid hormone. Cortisol is a steroid hormone, so that's like the stress hormone. I talk a lot about that in the other video. Androgens, calcitriol, testosterone, estrogens, progesterone. Okay, those are all steroid hormones. Okay, and depending on what they are, so like aldosterone is secreted in the adrenal cortex of the adrenal glands. Remember, cortex is like the outside of an organ or area, right? And the medulla is the inside area. Okay. And like testosterone, for example, is secreted in the testes. Okay, make sure you watch that other video. I go into more detail. Another class of steroid hormones are thyroid hormones. So T3 and T4. These are secreted by the thyroid gland, and they affect our metabolism, so how our body uses energy. Nitric oxide is also a thyroid hormone, and this affects the blood vessels, so it dilates and constricts blood vessels. Okay, and nitric oxide is secreted by the endothelial cells that line those blood vessels. Okay, water-soluble hormones, we have amines or amines, you can say either way. So amines end in NH3 groups, okay? So these include epinephrine, norepinephrine, melatonin, which is secreted from the pineal gland, histamine, and serotonin. Okay, so those are all water-soluble. Peptides and proteins as well. So everything released by the hypothalamus, okay? So the releasing and inhibiting hormones secreted by the hypothalamus, okay? Oxytocin, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, growth hormone, etc. So you could read through all the things that are peptides and proteins. It's a lot of them, okay? So those are all water-soluble. And eicosanoids are also water-soluble. So this would be prostaglandins, which are for an inflammatory response in the body, okay? And leukotrienes, which are for allergies. Okay. So how is our target cell going to respond to a specific hormone's action? Okay, so it's based on a few different things, okay? So first of all, the hormone's concentration in the blood, right? The more hormone there is in the blood, the more that hormone is going to act on the target cell unless those receptors become downregulated. The number of receptors, which is just what I was talking about downregulation or upregulation. The more receptors there are, the more hormone can bind, the higher the response is going to be in the cell. Influences by other hormones. So sometimes there are hormones that are synergistic with each other, help each other out, or antagonistic and kind of do the opposite of each other. Okay. So those are 3 of the different ways that a cell can respond to a hormone, or the 3 things that affect how a cell responds to a hormone. Okay. So an example of synergistic hormones would be testosterone and follicle stimulating hormone. We'll learn more about those a little bit later, but they both work together to produce sperm. Okay, we'll talk a lot about those when we get to reproductive system at the end of the semester. Okay, and then hormones that oppose each other are antagonistic would be like 2 that we already talked about in AMP1. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Okay, so calcitonin decreases blood calcium by building up bone and putting that calcium back in bone, and parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels by helping to break down bone, okay, or causing those osteoclasts to break down bone. Okay, so those ones are antagonistic. They work oppositely to each other. Okay, so hormones are generally secreted in short bursts, okay? So you'll get some secretion of a hormone and then it'll stop, and then you'll secrete more when it's needed, then it will stop. So it's mostly based on negative feedback mechanisms, okay? So when we secrete, those hormones are regulated by signals from the nervous system. So the nervous system can tell, right? Nervous system can act on glands as well. That's one of our effectors that we didn't really talk too much about in AMP1, but we'll talk a lot about now. Okay. Chemical changes in the blood, right? Like, so for calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, based on how much calcium we have in the blood, one or the other of those is going to be turned on. Okay. And other hormones can cause secretion as well. So the hypothalamus, for example, secretes releasing hormones that cause the pituitary gland to secrete other hormones, okay? So based on if those releasing hormones are released, or there's inhibiting hormones as well that tell the pituitary or hypothalamus to stop producing a hormone. Okay, so again, most of these hormones work on negative feedback, so some will be secreted. When we have enough of that hormone, something goes and tells the hypothalamus or pituitary or whatever gland to stop producing any more, and then when we need it again, it's turned back on. Okay, positive feedback, eventually positive feedback does of course get turned off, but more and more of a hormone is secreted until some sort of end occurs. Okay, so this would be like blood clotting, for example. More and more of those clotting proteins, which you'll learn about soon, are going to be secreted until the blood vessel is completely clogged, until it heals itself or starts healing itself. Okay, or another example of positive feedback would be childbirth. So oxytocin is secreted more and more and more, causing those stronger and stronger contractions of the uterus until after the baby is born. Okay. Okay. Now let us talk about the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Okay, so hypothalamus is in the brain. It's like kind of shaped like this, right? That's a hypothalamus. And connected to that, or hanging off of it, would be our pituitary gland. Okay, and it has 2 different regions, a posterior pituitary back here and an anterior pituitary. Okay, so I'm going to draw this in a different color just to show that these are 2 different structures here. Okay, now the posterior pituitary is also known as the neurohypophysis because it's made up of the same type of neural tissue as the hypothalamus. And the anterior pituitary is known as the adenohypophysis because it's made up of a different type of tissue. Okay, so you see that under the microscope, they're going to be stained differently because it's two different types of tissue. And they're connected to the hypothalamus by this stalk here. And this little stalk is known as the infundibulum. And I'll draw that out. I'll write that out. Infundibulum. Okay, so that's the stalk that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. Okay, so the anterior lobe here, we're going to say this is the anterior lobe, makes up 75% of the weight of the pituitary gland, and it secretes 7 different hormones. Okay, and we'll go through those hormones. And the posterior lobe, the neurohypophysis, is made up of that neural tissue. And it doesn't make any of its own hormones, unlike the anterior pituitary, which does make its own hormones. The posterior pituitary releases 2 hormones that are made by the hypothalamus. Okay. Now the hypothalamus is very important. Even though the pituitary gland is known as the master gland, the hypothalamus secretes everything that the pituitary gland needs in order to secrete any hormone. Okay. So the hypothalamus secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones that control release of the hormones by the pituitary gland. Okay, so it'll have, we'll talk about the different hormones that are released in each. Okay, so there are these neurons together known as the hypophyseal portal system, and those are where things travel from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to tell it what to release. Hypophyseal portal system. Okay. Okay, so this infundibulum here is made up of different neurons and nervous tissue, right? And then the hypophyseal portal system is going to be like these little capillaries where things can travel from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Okay. Okay. And then there are different secreting cells within the hypothalamus and within the pituitary. So those are trophic cells. Okay, so they end in TROPH, troph. Okay, so all those different cells secrete different types of hormones. Okay, so for example, we have growth hormone, right? That's one secreted by the anterior pituitary. Thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin, FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which are both important in the males and females in the reproductive system. Okay. Okay. So let's go through those hormones in more detail secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. So growth hormone is secreted by somatotrophs, okay? And the hypothalamus secretes growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, that acts on the somatotrophs to secrete growth hormone from the anterior pituitary, okay? What inhibits growth hormone would be growth hormone inhibiting hormone, GHIH, okay? Also known as somatostatin, okay? And growth hormone, it's just like what it sounds like, it helps us to grow. So it'll act on our bones, for example, when we're younger to help us grow. Okay, we don't secrete nearly as much when we're done growing. Thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so thyrotropin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus tells the thyrotropes in the anterior pituitary to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And that stimulates the thyroid, a lot of these are like in the name, to release T3 and T4. Okay, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone would also inhibit thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay. In the hypothalamus, gonadotropin releasing hormone causes gonadotrophs. The gonads are like the testes and ovaries, right? To secrete follicle stimulating hormone, which acts again in the male and female reproductive system. We'll learn a lot more about those. Okay. Gonadotropin releasing hormone also causes gonadotrophs to release luteinizing hormone, which is also important in the reproductive systems. Okay. Prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus causes lactotrophs to release prolactin, and lactose, right, is a sugar found in milk. So this is for creating milk in mammary glands. Okay, if someone who has had a baby. Okay. Also in the hypothalamus, we have corticotropin releasing hormone. It acts on corticotrophs, okay, in the anterior pituitary gland to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, okay. And then also corticotropin releasing hormone acts on corticotrophs in the anterior pituitary to secrete melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH. And melanocytes are what secrete melanin for the coloring of our skin. Okay, so that'd be released when we are out in the sun, and we need more of that melanin to help protect from those UV rays. Okay. So like we talked about already, we have negative feedback loops that control the secretion of all of those different cells, those thyrotrophs, those corticotrophs, etc. Okay, so we have our hypothalamus here, our pituitary gland here. So let's say we have corticotropin releasing hormone acting on our corticotrophs in our anterior pituitary gland to secrete ACTH. Okay, so to secrete ACTH, okay, adrenocorticotropic hormone, okay, that acts on the adrenal cortex of the adrenal glands. So here's our little adrenal gland. Okay, so that's going to act on the adrenal cortex, this outer area here. Okay, and it tells it to release cortisol. Okay, now once we have enough cortisol within the blood system, that is going to travel back up to both the anterior pituitary and tell it to stop secreting more ACTH, and also to the hypothalamus and tell it to stop secreting corticotropin releasing hormone. Okay, and then once we're low on cortisol and say we need it for whatever reason, now this system would get turned back on again, and that just continues to happen throughout our lives. Okay. Okay, so we talked about all of the hormones that anterior pituitary gland secretes. So growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, FSH and LH, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH right here, and MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. So those are the 7 hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary. Okay. Posterior pituitary gland secretes 2 hormones. It doesn't synthesize them, unlike the anterior pituitary, which does synthesize its own hormones. The posterior pituitary secretes 2 hormones that were made in the hypothalamus, and these 2 hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Just erase all of this. Okay. So this secretes, let's erase this too, oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Okay. Okay, so oxytocin we talked about a little bit. That is released based on a stretch in the cervix. So in the cervix, that's where the head is going to come out of the uterus, right? It's the entrance to the uterus, which we'll learn more about in reproductive system. But once that head places pressure on the cervix, it causes a stretching, okay? And that causes the release of oxytocin to start those contractions for childbirth, okay, when the baby is ready to be born, okay? And then again, this is a positive feedback system, okay? So the more and more oxytocin is released, so that those contractions keep getting stronger and stronger, okay? And it also helps to stimulate milk ejection when that happens, okay? And in response to suckling from the baby as well, okay? ADH. So ADH is a little bit more of a complicated hormone, okay? It's a little bit more in depth, okay? So ADH decreases output of urine, okay, based on our blood osmotic pressure, okay? So based on how much fluid there is in the blood, basically, how much water there is in the blood. So if we don't have enough water in the blood, we need to keep that water, because water is important in lots of different chemical reactions within our body, okay? So if we are dehydrated and we don't have enough water within our blood, ADH will decrease our urine output so that we can keep that blood within our body system, okay? So it's not too complicated, but it's just like a little bit more in depth than like oxytocin, for example, okay? So if we have an increase in blood volume, there would be a decrease in ADH secretion. So this would, if we have an increase in blood volume, that means we're very hydrated. We can release some of that extra water. We don't need all of it, right? We don't want too much water either, okay? If we have a decrease in blood volume, this would cause an increase in ADH, and that would tell our body to reabsorb that water and not send it out through the urine. Okay, so pretty straightforward, but a little bit more in depth there, okay? Okay. All right, let's end there, and I'll make a second video going over the second half of the PowerPoint.